Simcha, celebration of life.
Hello and welcome to Simcha, a celebration of life. I'm your host, Aaron Halevi. As the majority of Jews in South Africa come from Lithuania, they share certain genetic traits with each other, which can result in hereditary diseases. Scientific advancement in both the study and understanding of genetics has resulted in unprecedented breakthroughs in recent years.
The fundamental concept that we have to understand first and foremost is that God created an incomplete and, dare I say, an imperfect world. And Chazal, our sages, tell us that when we say, as we do every Friday night, Asher bara Elokim la'asot, which God created to do, so the Chazal explained that He created an imperfect world, giving us charge to perfect the world. And that exists across all areas, in terms of our personal life and in terms of health and well-being. There is certainly an aversion to the moment we talk about genetic modification, the moment we talk about genetic testing. Somehow or other there's an instinctive pullback from that, whether it be in the, call it the scientific world, whether it be in the medical fraternity, or just in people's minds alone. And yet the consistency doesn't exist. In other words, if a person is unwell, they wouldn't think twice about going to a doctor. We pride ourselves in the fact that today in modern day society, polio should not exist. We have eradicated it. With the Zika virus, we want to try and find a vaccine because we want to end it. Throughout the history of man, new maladies have presented themselves, and man has risen to the occasion of obliterating them from humanity, and thereby being able to improve our ability to live and the quality of life. And the question of genetic testing is in absolutely no way any different whatsoever. There are significant benefits and advantages to this because we're actually getting it before it becomes a problem.
Genetic testing is a series of tests to check whether people are carrying what we call a recessive mutation. When two recessive mutations come together, then we can have a patient presenting with a clinical condition, syndrome. And most of these conditions that we're testing for are lethal, or if not lethal, very much life-shortening. So we are trying to avoid people having to confront a devastating situation such as losing a child in a situation where we could perhaps have prevented it by doing genetic testing prior to them getting married or prior to them having a child. Now, just to clarify, in a condition that we all know very well, albinism, which is not one of the conditions we're testing for, just to explain how two healthy parents can have an affected child. The two parents have normal coloring, and then, hey presto, an albino child is born. So what's basically happened there is that both parents had a strong A gene and a weak A gene, and then in this particular reproductive cycle, the two small recessive A genes came together, and so an albino child is born. Similarly, we could have had one of the strong A's from the father and a weak one from the mother, which would be a situation of A, big A, little a, and then the child would be a carrier and not have the disease, as the parents were both, because you need two carriers to produce a child with the disease. Well, basically, all it is a blood test, which is then sent off to the laboratory. There are two different systems we can use. We've either got the Ashkenazi Jewish testing, which can be done through Lancet Laboratory. With our local testing, we can tell them the disease that they carry, and again, they'll decide they're going through with it or they're not, or we can give them other reproductive choices. The other system is called Dor Yesharim, which is an anonymous system where a person just gives the blood test and gets a number.
Dor Yesharim will test the individuals and enter each person into a database. It's an anonymous database. You're known only by number, and they don't ask you for your name at any point. And as soon as you enter the database, and it's recommended that this be done early, they say right after school here in South Africa, because many of the boys and girls go to study overseas after school, we tend to encourage them to do it in the matric year, around the 18th birthday. And boys and girls are tested. At that point, their blood is sent to a lab. The results are extracted. It's basically the same panel of diseases that are done around the world that will be done by local lab, 9 diseases. And those results are then entered into the database so that the information as to whether this individual is a carrier or not are going to be available when needed. This information will never be divulged to anybody, whether these individuals are carrier or not.
For many individuals, the ability to know if they are a carrier of certain genetic mutations has enabled their ability to prevent hereditary diseases. The Jewish community of South Africa is being proactive in encouraging genetic testing before marriage to create awareness and allow for preventative choices.
As a first and foremost, we have not a right but a responsibility to eradicate illness and so on. There's a famous passage in, I think it's one of the Midrashim, that Rabbi Akiva, together with a colleague of his, was walking in the street, and they were walking together with a farmer, and a gentleman came over and he was ill. And he says to Rabbi Akiva, please make me well. And Rabbi Akiva told him he should eat this and do that, etc. So when the gentleman had left, the farmer turns to Rabbi Akiva and says, how could you? If God wanted him to be sick, then God made him sick. And if God wants him to be cured, then let God do the curing. What right do you have to interfere in God's affairs? And without batting an eye, Rabbi Akiva says to this man, what do you have in your hand? And he says, it's a sickle. He said, what do you use it for? He said, well, I use it in order to ensure that my produce grows properly. I'm going to have to remove the weeds, and I'm going to have to prune and so on and so forth. So Rabbi Akiva says, but why do you do that? Why don't you just leave the land? Why do you have to remove the rocks? And why do you have to plow? And why do you have to sow? And why do you have to irrigate? And why do you have to prune? Just, if God wants you to have produce, you'll have produce. He says, but everybody knows. You can't just leave it and expect things to happen. And Rabbi Akiva said that's exactly the same thing. And therefore, from time immemorial, we have always been in a pursuit of how to help people live, of how to be well, of how to eradicate illness. And that actually becomes not simply an ideology, but a human obligation, a human duty.
We're testing for Tay-Sachs disease, where the baby might be born absolutely normal and starts with a slow neurological deterioration towards the end of the first year. And often the baby has passed away by age 2 or 3. We're testing for cystic fibrosis, which is also fairly common in the Jewish population. And in fact, in Israel, so common that every family who has an affected child is given a 4th-year physiotherapy student to come to their house every day to help them to do physiotherapy on the child. Then we're looking for something called familial dysautonomia, where the autonomic system is dysfunctional. Niemann-Pick disease, Gaucher's disease, mucolipidosis type 4, and there are a few others that have been added along the way. Niemann-Pick and Tay-Sachs are definitely fatal. Gaucher's type 1, which is the one that we're really looking for, is the neurological form. You get forms of Gaucher's disease where patients are affected in other organs, not specifically the central nervous system. And that one is, if not fatal, then the child has a very difficult life. Cystic fibrosis used to be fatal. By the time they were 10, there were no survivors. Fortunately, we've made great strides in our treatment of cystic fibrosis, so much so that we now have a large number of adult patients, but they have a fairly difficult lifespan as well, a fairly difficult life as well. They need to take enzymes with almost everything they eat in order to help them digest their food. They need to do daily physiotherapy to get rid of the thickened secretions that are within their chest. And often they might be doing 3 monthly drips lasting 2 weeks at a time. This is very demanding on the family's lifestyle and on the parents' on their time that they need to spend with the affected child. But having said that, our children with cystic fibrosis, which is the disease I deal mostly with, are lovely children, a bunch of very dedicated parents. And if you ask many of them, they say they've enriched their lives in a big way. But it certainly is a demanding disease.
Anybody that has had the unfortunate opportunity or experience, certainly of living with any of these maladies, and even seeing it from not too far, realizes the tremendous toll that it takes. Now, it's critical for us as Jews to understand a person born with any disability, no matter how severe, is as much a human being as anybody else. They have all the laws that relate to the saving of a life of a healthy, mobile, cogent individual applies to a person who is suffering from a genetic illness of whatever nature it might be, regardless of how terminal it might be. Once the person is born, there is no gradients of life. Life is absolute. It doesn't matter the age, it doesn't matter the wellness, life is absolute. The question is, what can we do in order to ensure that we don't get to a point where this kind of suffering is brought onto this world? And if God wants to find other ways to make us suffer, He's unfortunately got more than enough of a repertoire to do so. In terms of what's within our capacity to alter and to change, we have an obligation to do so.
So it really becomes an individual choice as to whether the parents would choose to know about the disease in advance and perhaps not even go forward with the shidduch, because often this is more well known in the more Haredi communities. The Haredi community are probably, for the broader audience, let's explain it with the ones who look externally more Jewish, possibly the ones who are wearing the black hats, the women who are covering their hair. And because matchmaking and arranged marriages was probably commoner in that population, that is possibly why the genes have also concentrated in them, and that's the population we're referring to. The ones who, for want of better, let's say, take the laws to the extreme and follow the laws according to the letter.
Dorishoim started in the mid-80s, early 80s. It was the brainchild of a man called Rabbi Yosef Eckstein. He and his wife are both carriers of Tay-Sachs, and they had several children who were affected. And they thought long and hard as to, why, because in the 80s testing was available, why they hadn't been tested, why they, ended up in this situation, and how he could devise a method that would work in his community. He is from Williamsburg, he's a Satmar Chassid, and he was looking at the Haredi world that he inhabits. So he looked for a way in which the testing could be anonymous, in which it could be done without stigma, and would work well in his community, and it's since spread to other communities.
So when they originally suggested this, there was a concern. And the concern was that if a person is not educated in what genetics means and how it works, in a community that is very insular, it could actually create a barrier against marriage. Because the moment you hear somebody is a carrier of Tay-Sachs, unless you understand that that's meaningless, you're going to say, well, we're not going to marry that person. We're not going to marry into that family. They carry Tay-Sachs. I don't know if I don't carry Tay-Sachs. I know that my wife and I, certainly both of us don't, because we were told we were allowed to go ahead with going out and getting married. And that's the way that Dor Yeshorim actually was set up. So Moshe Feinstein said absolutely nobody should know the results because of the potential of people misunderstanding what the result, a positive result means, which is nothing. It just means don't marry somebody who has the same positive result.
The Ashkenazim are one of the branches of Jews who come specifically from Europe, who have immigrated all over the world. The Sephardim come more from the North African countries and Morocco, Egypt, and such countries. So we believe that certain genes concentrate in certain races. And some of these ones that we are testing for have been thought to concentrate more in the Ashkenazim, just like certain genes concentrate in the Afrikaners, certain in Spaniards. So it's just a racial predilection for carrying a certain mutation. The point is that a lot of our ancestors have come from Lithuania and Eastern European countries. And because there's a small gene stock, there was marriage between these people from the Lithuanian countries, which by necessity would mean that our genes, our good genes and our bad ones, have concentrated in the population from emanating and originating from Lithuania, which is probably the reason why we are doing this Ashkenazi testing, because our gene pool has concentrated in the small number of families, the relatively small number of families who've married from Europe and have brought the genes with them to whichever countries they've gone to. But having said that, the Sephardim also carry some of these genes, so nobody must believe that if an Ashkenazi is marrying a person of Sephardi descent, that they cannot be carrying these abnormal mutations.
Welcome back. Dor Yeshorim is an international, confidential genetic screening system used mainly by the Orthodox Jewish community to prevent the transmission of genetic disorders. Certain mutations have an increased frequency among the Jewish community of South Africa, but can also be found in many other ethnic groups.
In South Africa, once a year we do a general screen, which is aimed at the matric year. We'll go to all the schools, we'll tell them about the test. I generally go myself and give a bit of a talk to the boys and the girls in the schools here. And then we have one afternoon when everyone comes together and the tests are done one after the other. Hatzolah are very helpful with this. They actually make their premises available and they allow their volunteers and responders to take the bloods. And so we managed to do about 50 or 60 a year during that screen. When we do a mass screen, it is a little bit cheaper because it's subsidized. That's how the labs operate. You give them more work, they can give you a better price. If somebody needs a Dor Yeshorim test kind of urgently anytime during the year, they can contact me and I will then organize it for them at that time. Cost a little bit more and the results are available within usually 2 to 3 weeks.
I think it's important for people also to be aware of the tremendous, tremendous emotional and sometimes fiscal cost that this can actually bring on a family. And I would consider it malpractice, not bringing it to people's attention and putting another human being through that circumstance, which was so avoidable. And unfortunately, the truth is, it still exists, even within the religious world, where people are not educated, maybe they're insular, whatever the case might be, and they confront a terrible set of circumstances.
I think more on the human level, where I'm dealing with families of different backgrounds on a daily basis who've got children with a particular disease. And I see how challenging this situation is. Any normal mother knows how challenging a child with a cold is. Now, how much more so is it going to be to know that day in and day out you've got specific therapies you have to do before you've even started. Now, this isn't to say either that every single child that comes out of this marriage is going to be affected with the condition. With every pregnancy, there's a 1 in 4 chance that the child could be affected. There's a 1 in 4 chance that the child will be 100%, not even a carrier. There's a 50% chance with every pregnancy that the child could be a carrier, and there's a 25% chance that the child could be affected. So when one really looks at it, there's a 75% chance that you'll have an unaffected child. Sometimes people hit bad luck and they have 2 or 3 pregnancies in a row that are affected by, that result in an affected individual. So as I say, it comes back to people's personal choices, whether they want to embark on such testing and try to prevent such issues, or whether they want to take the chance. And I think but speaking to people who have the affected child might influence the youngsters to test or not to test. Because I think sometimes, unfortunately, when we go ahead with shidduchim or with finding a boyfriend, we have such other superficial reasons for wanting to get involved with the person. She's pretty, he's tall, dark and handsome, he's got lots of money. And when it comes down to brass taxes, these are very unimportant things. When you can actually almost modify your life's choices by trying to avoid certain diseases in your family. Not that these children aren't wonderful and these patients aren't wonderful, but I think sometimes if you have the choice whether to go out or marry somebody with the same genetic diseases you have, or to go out with somebody else, perhaps you would choose not to have your life complicated by these diseases, when I think marriage is difficult enough and comes with its own challenges. Perhaps you don't want to choose to marry someone who has this particular genetic mutation that you have in your family.
The way I sometimes explain it is that, let's say someone's got 11 boys and the wife's pregnant. What are the odds of it being a boy or a girl? It's 50-50. There's no difference. The fact that they happen to have 11 before does not in any way mitigate that this 12th could in fact be a girl. And the same thing is true with Tay-Sachs. You know, if a person, God forbid, loses a child to Tay-Sachs, they can't scratch off and say, well, the next 3 are safe. That's not how statistics work. So it's terrifying. Wherever we can avoid these kind of things, we have to. We have to understand equally that children born with this, and sometimes, depending on what it is, people who live with this, God wanted them to be here. They are phenomenal neshamas. Their soul is something remarkable. I mean, these people are pure soul. The body's broken. All they are is pure soul. They are exceptional souls. And we all know if someone is blind, they have acute hearing. If someone is deaf, they have acute sight. In other words, the human body compensates for loss in one area by strengthening another. So if you have a difficulty in a physical sense, then obviously you're compensated significantly in a spiritual sense. You are spiritually very unique. If we looked at people like, with disabilities in that fashion, certainly the way in which we would treat them would be different. But that by the same token, that doesn't mean that we don't have an obligation, as much as we're capable of eradicating those kind of things.
Well, that's all we have for this week's episode of Simcha, a celebration of life. As always, we'd love to hear from you, so please send us a message on Facebook at Spirit Sister Productions. From me, Aaron Halevi, and the Simcha team, have a great week ahead.